Hello everybody, and welcome back to Ice Bear Tarot. I'm your host and reader, Ice Bear. Today we're going to do something a little different, and this is going to be the first in a short series of videos that I am calling Tarot 101, How to Read Tarot Cards the Ice Bear Way. Other folks who read cards and teach card reading may have different approaches, but I'm going to go through how I learned to do it. Spoiler alert, I taught myself. And give you some pointers that you might find useful if you're new to tarot reading, or maybe even if you're not. I expect there to only be a few videos in this series because the reality is that, like playing chess, learning tarot is really not that hard, but becoming proficient at it does take time and practice, and no amount of watching videos can replace that. I also think it is a bit like riding a bicycle in that once you learn how to do it, you never really forget, although if you don't do it for a while, it might take you a couple of janky readings to get back into the flow. So in this first episode, I'm going to discuss the process of choosing a deck, which is at the same time the most important and the least important part of learning to read tarot. The reason that I say it's the most important should be obvious. Without a deck, you can't do anything. And you really want to try to pick a deck that speaks to you in some way because doing so will make your job as a reader so much easier than if you pick some generic deck that you just don't connect with. However, I will also say that in some ways this is the least important part of the process because if you pick a deck that you're not vibing with, well, you can always get another one. At one time, I was a bit of a collector of tarot decks, but it was primarily because I liked the artwork, and I was only ever able to actually use a handful of them because the other ones just didn't speak to me in that way. And as you can see here, we have a cat again. He is on his blanket and just observing. So we'll see if he decides to get more involved or if he's just going to hang out over there and watch. Now, as a side note, I'm only going to be talking about classical tarot decks in this video, which is to say decks with the usual set of 22 major arcana and 56 minor arcana. There are plenty of other cards out there which are not actual tarot decks, and they often contain titles like Oracle or Angel or Spirit, and contain some other number of cards. Now, I don't have a problem with those decks, but I don't use them, and I can't speak to anything about them specifically. I think there are some types of readers who might gravitate towards decks like that, perhaps for the same reason that my deck of choice is what it is, and that's totally fine. I think what I'm going to say in this video applies just as well to those sorts of decks, even if they contain different kinds of cards. So, if you're into this sort of thing, and you'd like to see more from the People's Polar Bear, I am the People's Polar Bear, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's completely free for you, but it means a lot to me, and it pleases the robot overlords. Maybe someday it will even help pay for cat food, although I'm not planning to quit my day job. And every time one of these videos gets at least 10 views, I will take that as a signal that I should make at least one more. And yes, I am setting the bar pretty low, but this is also still a new channel, and the algorithm is a finicky mistress. Now, before getting into the weeds, let me just say that reading tarot is ultimately about you and your connection to your intuition and the universe, and with that in mind, I would argue that there is no one way to do any of this. Yes, there are traditional meanings for each of the cards, and there are common spreads that lots of people use, but in the end, these are merely frameworks that can help guide you in your own exploration. There are plenty of resources out there that can help you along the way, including, I hope, this series of videos. But in the end, you are the one making the choices. With that out of the way, the first thing I want to point out is that choosing a deck just based on the packaging is very much a crapshoot, and you'll probably be disappointed. The package may show only one or only a few of the actual cards, and maybe you'll be so enamored with the preview that you plunk down your hard-earned cash, only to be disappointed when you actually open the package. So if you come across a deck that interests you, unless it's just screaming your name when you pick up the box, you might want to go online and see if you can find additional pictures of the cards before you swipe your own card to buy it. Google is your friend here, but even then you may have to be careful, because even when you click on some result that takes you to a site that talks about the cards, they may not show you everything you want or need to know, which is something I'm going to talk about very shortly in the next section. If you can, buy a deck from a place that will allow you to return it if you find that it's not what you were expecting. And ideally, you could find a store that has open copies of some of their decks that you can look at. Now, this used to be a thing, but I don't actually know how common it is these days. Now, let's cover the types of cards. Again, we are not speaking about non-tarot oracle cards here. In my experience, there are 3 types of tarot deck, and I classify them largely based on how they treat the minor arcana, specifically the numbered cards. And I'm using this as my criterion because most decks, or at least all the ones that I've seen, tend to have fairly elaborate artwork on both the major arcana and the face cards of the minor arcana, but they differ greatly in how they treat the others. And so with that in mind, the first type of deck is the one that I'm going to call the minimalist. Now, remember in the previous section that I said packaging doesn't always tell you a lot, and even websites that talk about a particular deck that shows some of its cards might not tell you as much as you need to know? Well, here's an example of that, as well as an example of a minimalist deck. This is a Japanese tarot deck called the Miracle Tarot. I don't recall where or when I got it, but it was created by Shimizu Reiko and released in 1994, and apparently it's actually now a collector's item. If you're into anime or manga style artwork and you look at this package, you actually might be pretty impressed. And in fact, I was, and that's why I bought it. The drawings are very detailed, the figures have interesting facial expressions, and you might think that even though you don't read Japanese, this deck is pretty cool. If you do read Japanese, it comes with a rather large guidebook that has all kinds of stuff in it. My Japanese has gone to shit, so I can't read this anymore. When I first Googled this, actually the first site that did come up showed me additional cards. Mind you, this is well after I bought it. But it didn't show what the numbered cards were for the minor arcana. And in a minimalist deck, those cards are going to look like this. Here's the back, and here is the front. So as you can see, there's basically nothing here. It just says 10 of Pentacles, and it has 10 Pentacles on it. And all of the numbered cards in the minor arcana are like this. Now, the face cards of the minor arcana are not so austere, such as this Page of Pentacles. You can see that. But with a deck like this, unless you already know the canonical meanings of every card or are willing to look them up every time you do a reading until it becomes second nature, this deck isn't really that useful for anything other than playing poker. And I've actually never used this deck to do a reading, and I probably never will, because I just don't like the minimalist approach. But a deck like this could be good for someone who is looking for a bit more formal structure, less room for interpretation, and who wants to take the time to study the traditional meanings of the cards. Now, if you want a deck that falls into this category and doesn't cost $300 on the secondary market, the classic Marseille Tarot might be a good option. It's not a good fit for me, but it might be for you. At the other end of the spectrum is what I would call a fully intuitive deck. And the example that I'm going to show is the deck that I've used for most of the readings I've done throughout my life. And this is the Voyager Tarot, created by James Wanless and released in 1989. It still has 78 cards, and they're split into major and minor arcana like a traditional deck, but it has a few differences which, in my opinion, are not particularly significant. Instead of the suit of swords, like you would find in a traditional deck, it uses crystals. This is the Sage of Crystals. And instead of the suit of pentacles, it uses worlds. This is the Woman of Worlds, right here. Also in the minor arcana, it replaces the traditional page, knight, queen, and king with the child, man, woman, and sage. And so here, this is actually the Man of Wands. This is the Child of Cups, which would be the Page of Cups in a different deck. The Sage of Crystals, which otherwise would be the King of Swords. And then we have, as I showed before, the Woman of Worlds, which would be the Queen of Pentacles in a traditional deck. And finally, there also are changes to names of 8 of the major arcana, and some of which I find a little odd, such as changing the name of the Devil to Devil's Play. This is the Devil card, aka Devil's Play. I don't think that you might be able to see that. They also changed the name of the Judgment card to Time Space, and there are a couple others. And some traditionalists might not like this. Now, for the most part, I don't care, because with a deck like this, the name of the card is really secondary to the imagery and the feeling you get when you go into a particular card. You know, I mean, there is so much going on in all of these cards that you really have to look at them closely and really see where your intuition takes you and what you're being drawn to. This is very different from, you know, the Miracle Tarot or the other deck that I'm going to show after this one. And this is true of all the cards, including the numbered cards in the minor arcana, which is one thing that I actually really like about this. So here's the Four of Wands in this deck. Okay, there's a lot going on here, whereas if you look at a minimalist deck, I have a Four of Wands. Okay, well, I have 4 wands. Cool. If I didn't know what that meant, I would be lost. Here, if I don't know the canonical meaning, I can look at this card and I can figure it out. And so when you compare a fully intuitive deck to a minimalist deck, truly the difference is night and day. And this is why I call it a fully intuitive deck, because in order to get the most out of it, you really need to go deep into the imagery and the vibe from each card in each position in the reading and listen to what it's saying to you. You can certainly read a deck like this going based off of the traditional meanings, but you don't have to. And because each card is so visually rich, it's entirely possible to use this deck and become proficient with it without ever cracking open the guidebook. Yes, it takes some practice, and in the beginning, your readings might be a little slow as you try to figure out what's going on, but it's absolutely doable. And in fact, that's the approach I took, and it's how I do my readings to this day. I have the guidebook for this deck somewhere in the house, but I've never read it. Now, my view is that a deck like this could be good for someone who doesn't want to be tightly bound to tarot traditionalism and who wants to explore their own connection with their inner voice and the universe, but I'm not sure that I would recommend this exact deck to a beginner, particularly for someone who is planning to do a lot of readings for themselves. I've only used this deck to read for myself once, and several years later I can finally say that the reading was dead on, although I didn't know it at the time. With this deck, I feel like it is way too easy to be swayed into seeing what you want to see rather than what the cards are actually telling you, and I've also felt that some of the cards in this deck are just too positive. For example, the notion of renaming the devil to Devil's Play just seems kind of wrong, and the devil card in this deck, which I've showed before, it's right here, this just isn't dark and evil enough compared to a more traditional deck. Now that being said, this is also the only deck that I've ever really connected with, and so I work around the aspects that don't resonate. Now finally, I would say we have decks in the middle, like the one I used for the Kash Patel reading, and that is the Tarot of the Cat People. That's right here. This was made by Karen Kuykendall, sorry if I butchered that, and it was originally published in 1984. And remember what I said about judging decks based on the packaging? Well, really, the only card that is fully shown is this one. Otherwise, you're just kind of guessing, hey, what's in here? Now, these cards do have imagery on all of the minor arcana and the numbered cards, but it's not necessarily visually rich enough to the point where you can derive the meaning of the card just by looking at it. In some cases, you probably can, and in other cases, you probably can't. And for example, here is the Seven of Swords. You may recognize this from the Kash Patel reading. And typically, this represents some kind of deception. Now, if you didn't know that, and you just looked at the card, would you be able to figure it out? And I'm not sure that I would. You know, I can get there because I know what the card means, and when I look at this card, I see a person trying to trick a cat into being calm so that they can stab it. But I don't know if I'd draw the same conclusion if I didn't already know that's what I'm looking at. Now, on the other hand, with this card, the Four of Cups, again, this was in the Kash Patel reading, this card typically signifies disillusionment, disengagement, and apathy. And if you look carefully at, her facial expression, and the empty cups, and the cat that's kind of crying, and all of that, you might be able to derive those meanings. It seems a bit more clear to me. And even if I didn't already know what the card meant, I think the odds that I would be able to get there are much higher. I would say that decks like this are a good choice for beginners who aren't ready for a fully intuitive deck, or who aren't interested in a lot of study and memorization, or for people of any level who find both of the other types of deck a bit too extreme in one way or another. Maybe you just don't like the fully intuitive, and maybe you want more than just 10 pentacles. You do need to have, or be willing to learn, some amount of traditional tarot to use decks like this, but if the deck is well crafted, I think you'll have a much easier learning curve, because the images on the cards will help remind you of their traditional meaning. Now, I got this particular deck about a month ago, and I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't a minimalist deck, but I don't know how much I will use it in the future. That being said, during the Kash Patel reading, I thought it was pretty straightforward to interpret, so it may indeed make future appearances on this channel if I feel it's the right fit. Alright, now, all of that said, what do I recommend? And of course, the answer is, it depends. If you're just starting out, and you don't want to spend a lot of time learning traditional tarot, find an intuitive deck that speaks to you. Unless you're planning to do a lot of readings for yourself, in which case I would pick one of the other types. If you don't mind learning at least some traditional tarot, pick a middle path deck. The Rider-Waite deck can be a good choice for beginners, and I also like the Crowley deck because it gives you an opportunity to really dive deep into it if that's your sort of thing. And if you want a traditional paved path with lots of books to read and study in addition to your actual tarot practice, then you might be best served by a minimalist deck, like the Marseille. Because if you do learn all of the traditional stuff, that knowledge will easily transfer to other types of decks as you become more experienced. And if you're already an experienced tarot reader, then you're probably not watching this video, and you don't need advice from some internet polar bear. You do you, boo. Now, if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and if you got something out of this video, please consider hitting that like button, or that subscribe button, or both. My cat and I will love you forever, or until you unsubscribe, whichever comes first. And be sure to come back for the next video in this series, in which I will be talking about some different tarot card spreads, and what tends to work in what kind of reading. Ice Bear, out.